She was 7 months pregnant, standing in a garden full of 300 people, and her billionaire husband just slapped her across the face. Not in private, not behind closed doors, in front of senators, in front of family, in front of 16 security cameras that caught every single angle. Within the hour, his lawyers were offering $200,000 to make the footage disappear. Within 24 hours, his own mother had weaponized Grace's assault to steal a billion-dollar company. And within 72 hours, Grace would be sitting in a courthouse 35 weeks pregnant, being sued for $50 million, fighting to keep a baby she had not yet delivered. Here is what nobody expected. Grace did not fall apart. She got to work. And the man who thought money could erase everything, his father made sure it couldn't. Stay with me, because this story does not end where you think it ends. Lesson statement. This is a story about what happens when a woman finally believes herself more than she believes the lies she's been told, and discovers that the most dangerous person in the room is not always the one who raised their hand. If Grace's story stayed with you, if something in it felt familiar or gave you courage, or reminded you that leaving is not losing, then this story did exactly what it was meant to do. Hit the like button. It takes 1 second and it tells me that stories like this matter to you. Drop a comment below. Tell me which moment hit hardest. Was it the slap, the courtroom, the moment Grace stopped waiting to be rescued and started fighting back herself? I read every single one. Share this with someone who needs to hear it today. You might not know who that person is. Share it anyway. And if you are not subscribed yet, this channel exists for exactly this. Stories about real human choices, real consequences, and the unexpected strength people find when everything is on the line. Subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss one. I will see you in the next story. Take care of yourselves.
The champagne glass shattered against marble at exactly 9:47 in the evening. Then his hand connected with her face. 7 months pregnant, designer gown, 300 witnesses, and Grace Calloway Ashford's billionaire husband had just slapped her at his cousin's wedding in front of everyone who mattered in their world. But here is what Dominic Ashford did not know in that moment. 16 security cameras mounted across the Ashford estate had captured everything, every angle, every second, every lie he was already constructing before Grace's head had finished snapping sideways. And within 72 hours, those 16 angles would reach the one man in the world Dominic could not buy, could not charm, and could not escape. His father. Richard Ashford had built an empire on 2 things: hard work and an unbreakable moral code. He had shaken hands with presidents. He had turned a Pennsylvania steel town into a billion-dollar legacy. He had looked his son in the eye at every family dinner for 38 years and believed, truly believed, that he had raised a good man. He was wrong. And the moment he discovered how wrong he was, Richard Ashford would make a choice that cost him everything he had spent his life building: his son, his wife, his carefully constructed family legacy, and he would make that choice without hesitation. But we are getting ahead of ourselves. Right now, in this garden, with the orchestra faltering mid-note and 300 guests frozen in collective shock, Grace Calloway Ashford is standing by the rose garden fountain with her hand pressed to her swelling cheek and her other hand pressed to her pregnant belly, and she is making a decision that will change the rest of her life. Stay with me. This one is going to hurt before it gets better, but I promise you, it gets better. The Ashford estate in Connecticut was the kind of place that made ordinary people feel slightly ashamed of their own homes. 12 acres of manicured grounds, a main house built in 1894 and renovated 4 times since, each renovation more expensive than the last. Fountains that actually worked, gardens that employed 3 full-time staff just to maintain. And on this particular Saturday evening in late April, all of it was dressed up for Meredith and Vincent Cross's wedding, like a movie set designed to make every guest feel that this precise level of wealth and taste and carefully curated beauty was simply how life was supposed to be lived. Grace had attended 14 Ashford family events in 3 years of marriage. She had learned to move through them the way you learn to move through a minefield. Carefully, deliberately, always aware of where the pressure points were buried. Tonight, the pressure point was a man named Gerald Whitmore, a colleague from Grace's former law firm, who had the misfortune of being invited to this wedding and the further misfortune of speaking to Grace for approximately 4 minutes near the bar about a case she had worked on before she quit to become Dominic Ashford's wife. 4 minutes. That was all it took. Grace felt Dominic before she saw him, a shift in the air, a particular stillness in the guests nearest to her. She turned, and there he was, moving across the garden toward her, with that particular walk he had, smooth, unhurried, the walk of a man who had never once in his life needed to rush because everything always waited for him. He smiled at Gerald, shook his hand, said something charming. Gerald laughed and drifted away, sensing without being told that the conversation was over. Dominic's smile stayed in place until Gerald was out of earshot. Then he took Grace's elbow and steered her toward the rose garden fountain, away from the nearest clusters of guests, and his grip on her arm was gentle enough that no one watching would have seen anything wrong. She knew better. "You were flirting," he said. His voice was quiet, conversational, the tone he used when he wanted her to understand the seriousness of a situation without raising any alarm for the people around them. "I was talking about the Harrington merger," Grace said. "Gerald worked on the same case. It was professional. You were laughing. People laugh during professional conversations, Dominic." His grip on her elbow tightened by a fraction. In the background, Harper Wells, Grace's best friend since their first week of law school, currently serving as one of Meredith's bridesmaids and simultaneously narrating the fashion disasters of the evening into Grace's earpiece, went suddenly silent. Harper had spotted Dominic's expression from 40 feet away. The earpiece crackled. Harper's voice, low and urgent. "Grace, I'm coming. Don't," Grace murmured, so quietly it barely moved her lips. "You are my wife," Dominic said. "You represent this family. When you stand at the bar laughing with men I don't know, it reflects on me." "I represent myself," Grace said. And even as she said it, she felt the particular exhaustion of having this conversation again, the same conversation in different forms, the one that always ended the same way, with Grace apologizing for something she had not done wrong, and Dominic's grip on her elbow relaxing, and both of them returning to the party as if nothing had happened. Except, tonight, something different happened. The champagne glass slipped from Grace's hand. She grabbed for it, missed, and it shattered on the marble paving at their feet. She startled back. Her heel caught on the edge of the stone, and Dominic's hand pulled back and connected with the side of her face. The sound was sharp and flat and unmistakable. The orchestra faltered mid-phrase. A cello bow dragged across the wrong string. The music died in sections, instruments dropping out one by one as musicians registered what had just happened. 300 people turned. Grace's head had snapped sideways. Her cheek burned with a heat that spread instantly across her face. The baby kicked hard inside her belly. Startled, sudden, a small foot or elbow connecting with her ribs, as if to say, "I felt that too." 7 months along, and her daughter already knew something was wrong. Dominic's face transformed in the space of a single breath, the rage. And it had been rage. She had seen it clearly, pure and unguarded for one unmasked second, simply vanished. Concern bloomed across his features like a man pulling on a coat. Honey, who said? He said, reaching for her. You stumbled. Let me help you. Grace jerked back. Her voice, when it came, surprised her, clear, steady. The voice of the attorney she used to be before she became Dominic Ashford's wife. I didn't stumble. His eyes flashed. A warning, just for her. Then the mask was back, perfect and practiced. You're confused, he said softly, for the audience forming around them. The pregnancy. You've been so dizzy lately. Harper arrived. Pink chiffon bridesmaid dress, cheeks flushed, placing herself between Grace and Dominic with the focused energy of someone who had made an immediate and irreversible decision. Grace, are you okay? She fainted, Dominic said. His smile never wavered. The heat? The pregnancy hormones? I saw what happened, Harper said. She did not look at Dominic when she said it. She looked at Grace. Above them, mounted on stone pillars and tucked into garden arbors, 16 security cameras recorded every angle of the Ashford estate, every moment, every movement, every slap. Grace's hand trembled as she touched her cheek, already swelling. By tomorrow, it would bruise. She knew from experience how to cover bruises with makeup. The thought hit her like cold water because she recognized it. The automatic, practiced knowledge. 3 layers of concealer, carefully blended, the strategic angles in photographs, the excuses that came too easily. I walked into a cabinet door. I'm so clumsy lately. The pregnancy makes me dizzy. How many times had she done this? How many mornings had she stood at that bathroom mirror in the penthouse and covered evidence with her fingertips, then told herself it wasn't that bad, then gone downstairs and made coffee for a man who had hurt her and convinced herself that the man drinking the coffee was the real Dominic, and the other one, the one who had hurt her, was just stress, just pressure, just temporary? Natalie Ashford materialized at her son's side. Pearls, diamonds. The particular expression of a woman who had spent decades perfecting the art of appearing sympathetic while being neither. Darling, Natalie said, addressing Grace, let's get you inside. You need to rest. Your son hit me, Grace said, in front of 300 people. Natalie's mouth tightened almost imperceptibly. You fainted, dear. Dominic caught you. Senator Morrison's wife saw the whole thing. The gaslit narrative assembled itself in real time, in public, with the efficiency of a machine that had clearly been running for years. Grace looked at Dominic. She looked at Natalie. She looked at the guests around her, business associates, family, every person who mattered in the Ashford world, and she watched every single one of them beginning to choose the story that was more comfortable. She touched her belly. Charlotte kicked again. I'm not leaving with him, Grace said. Dominic's jaw tightened. His voice dropped, just for her. You are my wife. You are carrying my child. You are leaving with me. No. The word felt foreign. She could not remember the last time she had said it and meant it. Harper's hand found hers and held on. Above them, 16 cameras recorded everything. Grace locked herself in the bridal suite, with Harper standing guard outside, and spent 40 minutes sitting on a heated bathroom floor in a $7,000 maternity gown trying to decide if she was brave enough to do what she already knew she had to do. The bathroom was larger than her first apartment. Crystal vases, fresh flowers, a mirror framed in antique gold worth more than most people's cars. All that money, all that beauty, and she had never felt more trapped. 3 times she reached for her phone. Lock screen, unlock, lock screen, unlock, that compulsive checking. The nervous habit when anxiety spikes and your hands need something to hold on to because nothing else in the world feels controllable. Dominic knocked twice. His voice through the door was tender, practiced, perfectly calibrated for the hallway staff who might be listening. "Grace, baby, can we talk? I'm so sorry. The stress of the merger, I wasn't myself." He was never himself. That was the whole problem. The man she had married, charming, attentive, tentative, devoted, had never been real. He was a performance. The real Dominic was the one who got angry when dinner wasn't ready, who criticized her weight during pregnancy, who had hidden her prenatal vitamins once and told her she was imagining things when she couldn't find them, who had gradually, methodically, and with great patience, dismantled every part of her life that existed outside of him: her career, her friends, her finances, her confidence, until the only thing left was him. She had let him do it. That realization was almost worse than the slap. She opened the door on the chain. Dominic's face was arranged in remorse. Natalie hovered behind him. "I was trying to steady you," Dominic said. "That's not what happened." "That's exactly what happened," Natalie said, stepping forward. "Grace, sweetheart, you've been under so much stress. The pregnancy, the hormones. You're not thinking clearly." Grace looked at Dominic. She looked at Natalie. She thought about the next 30 years. Charlotte growing up in this world, learning that this was normal. Learning that love looked like this. "Get away from my door," Grace said. She closed it. She locked it. She slid down against the wood and sat on the heated floor again, and this time she didn't reach for her phone. She heard Harper's voice in the hallway, steady and firm, and then she heard Dominic and Natalie's footsteps retreating down the marble corridor. Then Harper's quiet knock. "They're gone. I texted Owen Grant. He's the security director. He's got 3 daughters, Grace. He'll help." Owen Grant met Grace at a coffee shop 12 blocks from the Ashford penthouse 3 days later. She had been staying on Harper's couch, sleeping in borrowed clothes, wearing concealer over a bruise that had turned the exact shade of yellow that meant it was almost healed, but not quite. Owen was early 30s, plain-faced, professional in a way that had nothing to do with performance. He set a tablet on the table between them before he said a word. "I'm risking my job being here." "Then why are you?" "I have 3 daughters." He tapped the screen. Security footage loaded, multiple angles, crystal clear, high definition. Grace watched herself stand by the fountain, watched Dominic approach, watched his hand pull back, watched it connect. No stumble, no feint, no confusion, just violence. Seeing it from outside her own body made it real in a way the memory could not. The memory she could doubt, question, soften, explain away. But the footage simply was what it was.
Son.
16 camera angles, Owen said quietly, all showing the same thing. "Your husband's lawyers contacted us within an hour, offered $50,000 for the drives. You didn't take it. I have daughters." He paused. "When I refused, they went to $200,000. When I still refused, they said they'd get a warrant." He slid the tablet across. "I made copies first. This one's yours." Grace stared at the screen. 16 angles of the worst moment of her life. 16 pieces of evidence that could not be gaslit into something else. "There's more," Owen said. He pressed play on an audio file. Dominic's voice. Raw, unguarded, nothing like the tender husband at the door. "That woman is making me look bad. I don't care if she's pregnant. She needs to learn her place." Natalie's response, calm and practical. "Handle it quietly. Your father cannot know about this. The merger with Westbrook is too important. We cannot afford scandal right now. Dominic, she's my wife, my property." I'll handle her however I want. Natalie. Then be smart about it. Pay her off if you need to. Make her sign something, but keep it quiet. Grace set down her coffee cup very carefully because her hands were shaking and she did not want to drop it. She had known Dominic thought those things, but hearing them said out loud, hearing his mother help him plan how to manage her like a business problem. It broke something inside Grace that she had not known was still intact. Mrs. Ashford, Owen said. Grace, I've worked security for 20 years. Men like your husband don't stop. They escalate. I know. Do you? Because I've also seen women go back. Believe the apologies. Believe it'll be different. It's never different. No. He held her gaze. So I also sent a copy to someone else. Richard Ashford's assistant, Eleanor Price. She's been with him 30 years. And between you and me, she's been waiting for an excuse. Grace absorbed that. Then she made her second active choice of the past 72 hours. She copied the footage to 3 separate locations. A cloud account, an encrypted drive Harper's cousin had set up in Denver, and her own email, time-stamped, authenticated, untouchable. Owen watched her do it. When she finished, he nodded once. You were a corporate attorney before you married him, he said. Yes? Good. You're going to need to remember how to think like one. Richard Ashford had been at his desk since 5:45 in the morning when Eleanor Price walked in at 6 with a tablet and an expression he had seen exactly twice in 30 years of working together. Both previous times, the world had been about to change. We have a problem, she said. She placed the tablet on his desk. Meredith's wedding, 3 days ago. You need to watch this. Richard watched the footage once. His face remained neutral. Decades of negotiation had taught him never to show emotion in the moment of receiving difficult information. You received it, you processed it, then you decided. He watched it again. Dominic's hand pulling back, the slap. Grace's head snapping sideways, her hand flying to her pregnant belly. That instinctive, immediate, devastating gesture of a mother protecting her child. Richard's knuckles whitened around his coffee cup. Who else has seen this? Owen Grant, your daughter-in-law, her friend. Eleanor paused. And Natalie. Natalie contacted me about Grace having a pregnancy episode at the wedding. I know what Natalie told you. Eleanor's voice was level. She also appears on the audio recording. She pressed play. They listened to Dominic and Natalie together. The voice of his son, the voice of his wife of 32 years, planning how to manage the situation, paying off witnesses, keeping it from Richard because of a merger. Richard set down his cup with deliberate care. The china clicked against the saucer, loud in the silent office. Get James Caldwell here within the hour. And get Grace. Eleanor recognized that tone. She had heard it twice before. Once when Richard's business partner had embezzled funds over a 3-year period. Once when his brother had attempted a hostile takeover of Ashford Industries. Both men had been addressed with the same controlled, precise, permanent consequence. I'll make the calls, Eleanor said. Richard turned to the window. 60 floors up, Manhattan spread below him. The city he had helped build, the empire he had spent his life creating. He thought about his own father, a steel worker who had died at 46 of black lung from the mills. Richard had been 8 years old. He remembered watching his father grow weaker over 2 years, remembered the blood in the handkerchiefs his mother washed and replaced and never mentioned, remembered sitting at the kitchen table and watching his parents exist in the same small house. And he remembered this. His father had never once raised a hand to his mother. Not once, not during the worst of it, when money was short and the bills were past due, and 3 kids needed shoes, and stress pressed down on everyone in that house like a physical weight. His father had looked Richard in the eye one evening when Richard was 7 and said, simply and without drama, "A real man protects. He does not hurt." Richard had built his entire life on that principle, and somehow, he had raised a son who did the opposite. Grace arrived at 9 exactly. Eleanor met her at the elevator. Richard stood when she entered and gestured not to his desk, but to the sitting area by the window. The comfortable chairs, the equal footing. She looked exhausted. She had covered the bruise well, but Richard could see the shape of it beneath the makeup, the slight discoloration along her cheekbone. That concealer could diminish, but not erase. "Thank you for coming," he said. "Please sit. Can I get you anything?" "I'm fine." "You are not fine." His voice was controlled fury, precise and restrained. "My son struck you while you were pregnant with his child, in public, surrounded by family. Nothing about this is fine." Grace sat across from him. Every instinct she had developed over 3 years of Ashford family events was screaming that this was a trap. Rich men protected rich sons. Family protected family. But Richard's expression was not the face of a man managing a problem. It was the face of a man who was genuinely ashamed. "I've seen the footage," Richard said. "All 16 angles. I've heard the audio. I know my wife helped cover it up." He held her gaze. "I am not here to protect Dominic. I am here to help you." Why? Because legacy is not money. It is character. The name we leave behind. His jaw tightened. "I built this company on integrity. My son destroyed that in one moment, and I intend to address it." James Caldwell arrived. The family attorney, confusion written across his face, and watched the footage and spent 3 minutes cycling through shock and professionalism before he said what every attorney says when everything is about to get complicated. "Richard, before we proceed, if you move against Dominic, the Westbrook merger could collapse. The board will question your judgment. Natalie will fight this. Dominic will sue. The company could take a significant hit." "I understand." Stock price, investor confidence, 30 years of... James. Richard's voice was very quiet. "My son beat his pregnant wife. I do not care about mergers." James looked at Grace. "You need independent counsel, someone not connected to this family." Eleanor appeared in the doorway with her phone. "Margaret Sullivan is on her way. Best divorce attorney in New York. She owes me a favor." Things were moving faster than Grace could process. Richard Ashford was offering to help her, to protect her, to testify against his own son. She kept waiting for the condition, the catch, the thing she would have to give up in exchange. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Why are you doing this?" Richard was quiet for a moment. "Then, when I was 8 years old, I saw my father hit my mother once. One time. He was under tremendous stress. He slapped her, and I heard the sound, and I was terrified." He looked out the window. "My mother took me and my sister to her parents' farm. She told my father she would not come back unless he got help. He did. He changed. They stayed together 40 more years." He looked back at Grace. "But I never forgot that sound. I swore I would never be that man. Never raise a son who would be that man." His hands, this powerful, controlled man's hands, trembled slightly around his coffee cup. "I failed in raising him. I will not fail in addressing it." Grace looked at this man who had just offered to dismantle his own life's work because it was the right thing to do. She thought about Charlotte, about what she wanted her daughter to know about the people who had surrounded her birth. She put the tablet on the table between them. "Then let's get to work," she said. Margaret Sullivan was exactly what her reputation promised. Sharp suit, sharper eyes, the particular energy of a woman who had won so many impossible cases that impossible had simply stopped being a category she recognized. Within 2 hours of meeting Grace, she had a plan. Within 4 hours, she had a filing, divorce petition, emergency custody order, restraining order, documentation of abuse with 16 authenticated camera angles, all filed simultaneously at 9 on a Monday morning. By noon, Dominic had been served. Grace watched from the Connecticut safe house, the colonial property on the Ashford estate that Richard had immediately transferred to her name. Surrounded by Harper, her mother, who had flown in from Wisconsin, Margaret, and what Harper described as approximately enough baby supplies for a small country. "I cannot believe we won," Harper said, raising a glass of sparkling water in Grace's direction. "He's served. He's done. You have legal protection. This is over." Grace's phone rang. Eleanor Price. She answered. "Grace." Eleanor's voice had something in it that Grace had not heard before. Not urgency exactly, something more careful than that. "There's something you need to know about the footage leak." The footage had reached national media that morning. All 16 angles of Dominic Ashford striking his pregnant wife, trending across every major platform. Richard's press conference had aired at 11. He had stood at a podium in front of the Ashford Industries logo and said the words clearly and without hesitation. "My son struck his pregnant wife. It is indefensible. He is disowned. The Ashford name will not protect violence." "It wasn't Owen who leaked it to the media," Eleanor said. "Then who?" A pause. "It was Natalie." Grace felt the floor shift under her feet. "Natalie leaked the footage herself," Eleanor continued. "Not to help you. I've been going through the corporate documents, Grace. There's a clause in the original Ashford Family Trust. A clause Richard signed 20 years ago without fully understanding its implications. If Dominic is publicly removed from Ashford Industries for cause, and if that removal is publicly confirmed, the co-signatory on the original family trust gains controlling interest in the company." "Who is the co-signatory?" "Natalie." The silence that followed lasted 4 seconds. Then Grace understood. All of it. The reason Natalie had coordinated the cover-up at the wedding, not to protect Dominic from consequences, but to control the timing. The reason she had apparently decided to leak the footage herself, because she needed the removal to happen in a specific way, through a specific sequence of events, triggered by the press conference that Richard had held this morning, believing he was doing the right thing. Natalie had not been trying to protect her son. She had used Grace's abuse as a financial weapon to take her husband's company. "The press conference Richard held this morning," Grace said slowly, "triggered the clause," Eleanor confirmed. "Natalie now has grounds to claim controlling interest in Ashford Industries. Her lawyers filed within the hour." Harper had been watching Grace's face. She set down her glass. Grace looked at Margaret. Margaret was already on the phone. "This changes everything," Margaret said, covering the receiver. Natalie can now fund Dominic's defense from company resources, limitlessly." Grace went to the bathroom and sat on the edge of the tub and pressed both hands against her belly, and said nothing for a very long time. She had thought it was over. She had thought the person working against her was Dominic. She had not understood, until this moment, that Natalie Ashford was something far more dangerous than a man who lost his temper. Natalie was a strategist, and Grace had been a piece on Natalie's board from the very beginning. Actionable advice for anyone watching who recognizes this dynamic. Abuse within wealthy families rarely involves only the abuser. The people who benefit from maintaining silence, financially, socially, politically, become part of the system. Before you trust anyone in your partner's circle, ask yourself what they have to gain from your silence. Because sometimes the most dangerous person in the room is not the one who hit you. It is the one who watched it happen and immediately started calculating. The catastrophes came fast. That was the thing about them. Not that they were unforeseeable in retrospect, but that they arrived in rapid succession, each one landing before Grace had finished absorbing the last. Catastrophe 1 came on Tuesday morning. Anthony Castellano, Dominic's new defense attorney, described by Margaret with the particular professional admiration of one opponent for another as the most ruthless domestic violence defense lawyer in the country, filed an emergency motion to suppress all footage from the wedding. His argument was technical and precise and devastatingly effective. Owen Grant had made unauthorized copies of the security footage without proper chain of custody documentation. The copies had passed through multiple hands. The authentication was compromised. The judge granted a temporary hearing. Pending chain of custody verification. The footage was inadmissible. Margaret delivered the news over the phone. Grace listened without speaking until she was done. So, without the footage, Grace said, "It's my word against his." Yes. Against a billionaire family with 30 years of established credibility in this city. Yes. Grace hung up and stared at the ceiling of the Connecticut house for approximately 90 seconds. Then she called Owen Grant. Catastrophe 2 came on Wednesday. Dr. Claire Hensley, Grace's OB-GYN, the physician who had quietly and carefully documented 3 years of injuries at appointments Grace had attended alone because Dominic did not like her to speak privately with doctors, received a subpoena. Castellano had obtained Grace's private therapy records from before the marriage. Grace had seen a therapist for anxiety in her late 20s, briefly, professionally, the way millions of functional adults do. The records were old. They were unremarkable. But in the hands of a skilled defense attorney, unremarkable could become a pattern. Anxious, prone to misinterpretation, a history of emotional instability. Simultaneously, a tabloid ran a story. The headline, Gold Digger or Victim, Grace Calloway's Calculated Rise. The sourcing was described as a close friend with direct knowledge of the marriage. The quotes included details that only 3 people could have known. Details from private conversations, from moments inside the marriage that had never been shared publicly. Harper spent 4 hours cross-referencing the information before she confirmed what she had suspected. The source was Grace's cousin, who had been paid $40,000 by a representative of the Ashford family. Grace read the tabloid story on her phone, sitting in the kitchen of the Connecticut house while her mother made breakfast behind her and pretended not to be watching. She set the phone face down on the table. Her cousin. They had grown up together. She had been a bridesmaid at Grace's wedding. Catastrophe 3 came on Thursday morning, and it was the worst one. Dominic's legal team filed a counter-motion. Grace Calloway Ashford, the motion stated, was an unfit mother. Evidence submitted included her history of mental instability, her erratic behavior at the wedding, her decision to abandon the marital home impulsively, her refusal to co-parent, her current living situation in an undisclosed location while 7 months pregnant. They requested immediate temporary custody of Charlotte, pending a psychiatric evaluation of Grace, to be placed with the Ashford family, pending the evaluation's outcome. The judge assigned to the motion was unfamiliar with the case. Working from paper, the motion read cleanly, a concerned father seeking to ensure the safety of an unborn child whose mother had left the home under unclear circumstances. The judge granted a 72-hour emergency hearing. If Grace could not prove her fitness as a mother within 72 hours, Her unborn daughter could be placed with the Ashford family before she was even born. Margaret called with the news at 8 in the morning. Grace listened to the entire explanation before she spoke. "Cecile," Grace said, "my evidence is suppressed. My therapy records are being used against me. My cousin sold information to Dominic's team, and I have 72 hours before a judge decides whether I can keep my own baby." "Yeah," Margaret said. "I'm 35 weeks pregnant, I know. And Natalie now controls the company funding Dominic's defense." "Yes." Grace looked out the window of the Connecticut house. The garden was budding. Early April green, tentative and new, the kind of spring morning that looks peaceful from the inside of a crisis. "Okay," she said. "Okay? Give me an hour. I have some calls to make." She hung up. Sat still for 30 seconds. Then she picked up her phone and started working. The first call was to Owen Grant. "The chain of custody argument," Grace said. "It only works if there's a single compromised copy. How many copies exist?" "Officially," Owen said, "one. And unofficially?" "A beat. I may have accidentally emailed myself a version 3 days before your husband's lawyers contacted us. Full footage, all 16 angles, time-stamped by the server at the Ashford estate. Authenticated metadata intact, never transferred or touched by anyone except the original security system." Grace closed her eyes for 1 second. "Owen Grant," she said. "You methodical, wonderful man." "My daughters helped me set up the email account," he said. "They're very thorough." The chain of custody argument collapsed. The footage was back. The second call was to Patricia Holloway, the retired federal judge who had been Grace's mentor at her law firm, who had sent a handwritten note when Grace got engaged, and a more carefully worded handwritten note when Grace quit her job. Who had been waiting, Grace now understood, for a call she had hoped would never come. "I need a character witness," Grace said. "Someone a judge will take seriously." "I'll be there," Patricia said. No hesitation. The third call was the hardest. Dr. Claire Hensley answered on the second ring. "Tell them everything," Grace said. "Every appointment, every injury, every time I said I was fine and you knew I wasn't." A pause, then, "I've been waiting 3 years for that call, Grace." "I know, I'm sorry it took this long. Don't be sorry. Just let me help." Grace spent the next 6 hours rebuilding her case from the inside out, not waiting for people to arrive and save her, but identifying every weakness Castellano had exploited and systematically closing each one. She called her former law firm and requested access to her own personnel file. She compiled a chronological record of every injury Dr. Hensley had documented. She wrote out a detailed timeline of financial control, every account Dominic had managed, every expense that had required his approval, every professional opportunity she had passed on at his insistence. She was not a victim waiting for rescue. She was an attorney building a case. Harper found her at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning, surrounded by documents, eating crackers because she had forgotten to eat dinner. "You need to sleep. I need to finish this. You need to sleep so you can finish this." Harper sat down across from her and stole a cracker. "Can I say something? If it's quick." "You used to be the most terrifying person in any room. Your first year, you argued a securities case in front of a senior partner panel, and one of them literally clapped when you finished, like he forgot he wasn't supposed to." Harper held her gaze. "That woman didn't disappear when you married Dominic. He just convinced you she did. She's sitting at this table right now at 2 in the morning, building a case against a billion-dollar legal team while 35 weeks pregnant, and she is absolutely terrifying." Grace looked at her best friend. "The crackers are stale," she said. "I know. I bought them 2 weeks ago. Thank you, Harper. Don't thank me. Win. The 72 hours passed in a blur of preparation, strategy, and the particular exhaustion of being heavily pregnant while simultaneously fighting for custody of the child you were carrying. Grace's blood pressure climbed. Dr. Hensley came to the house daily. Grace rested when ordered and worked when allowed, and spent the hours in between talking to Charlotte, pressing her palm flat against her belly and explaining in a low voice that everything was going to be all right, that her mother was handling it, that she just needed to stay put for a little while longer. Charlotte, apparently satisfied with this explanation, stayed put, actionable advice for anyone in a similar position. When someone uses your past against you, therapy records, old mistakes, moments of genuine vulnerability, remember that seeking help is not evidence of weakness. It is evidence that you are paying attention to yourself. Any judge worth their position understands the difference between someone with a history of seeking mental health support and someone who is genuinely unfit. Do not let your courage in asking for help be weaponized against you. Document your reasons. Find your witnesses. Tell the truth. The truth, as Margaret had said from the beginning, was always their best argument. Eleanor Price had worked for Richard Ashford for 30 years, which meant she knew where everything was. Every contract, every negotiation, every agreement Richard had signed over 3 decades of building an empire. She had filed them, tracked them, cross-referenced them, and maintained them with the organizational precision of someone who understood that institutional memory was its own form of power. She found the first anomaly on a Tuesday evening, working alone in Richard's office after everyone else had gone home. It was a non-disclosure agreement dated 5 years before Grace and Dominic's wedding. Signed by a woman named Stephanie Crawford, settlement amount $800,000. The stated reason for the agreement was described in deliberately vague legal language as the resolution of a private dispute related to a personal matter. Eleanor read it twice. Then she pulled the associated file. Stephanie Crawford had been Dominic's girlfriend during his years at Dartmouth and the 2 years after. She had been described in a family photograph from that period as lovely and bright. The photograph was the only record of her existence in the Ashford files until the NDA. Eleanor dug further. There had been an incident, a ski resort in Vermont, a private chalet, Dominic and Stephanie alone for a weekend, and then Stephanie in an emergency room 2 hours away with a story that shifted between versions and a lawyer who appeared beside her within 12 hours, not her own lawyer, but one connected to the Ashford family. The NDA had been negotiated over 48 hours. Stephanie had signed it without independent counsel. Eleanor sat very still for a long time. Then she called Richard. He came to the office within the hour, read the file in silence, set it down. "Find Stephanie Crawford," he said. Eleanor had already started. Stephanie Crawford now lived in Portland, Oregon. She ran a bakery called Early Bird on a corner near the waterfront. She had a partner named David and a 4-year-old son named James. She had, by all appearances, built a careful, quiet life far away from everything connected to the Ashford name. Eleanor reached her by phone on a Wednesday morning. The call lasted 11 minutes. Stephanie had kept copies of everything, despite the NDA, despite the $800,000. Despite the 48 hours of pressure that had produced her signature on a document she had signed, frightened and alone and without anyone in her corner. She had kept copies because she had known, even then, that this would not be the last time. "I waited," Stephanie told Eleanor. "I knew he would do it again. I just didn't know who it would be." Eleanor brought this to Richard. And Richard, this man, who had already sacrificed his son and his company's stability and was now facing the reality that his wife had brokered a cover-up of a previous assault, sat in his office for a very long time. Then he picked up the phone and called Grace. "I owe you an apology," he said, "that I don't have adequate words for. I failed to see what my son was. I failed to see what my wife enabled. I should have known." Grace listened. "But I have something that may help," Richard said. "And I have someone who wants to testify." When Grace received the news about Stephanie Crawford, she went outside and stood in the Connecticut garden for a few minutes in the early evening air. The NDA Stephanie had signed, Eleanor's legal research confirmed, was almost certainly voidable. It had been signed under duress, without independent counsel, under circumstances that constituted coercion. A good attorney, Anne Margaret Sullivan, was considerably better than good, could make the argument successfully. Stephanie Crawford had driven 3,000 miles to make it. Grace thought about Stephanie 5 years ago, alone in a lawyer's office, with $800,000 on the table, and no one in her corner. She thought about the version of herself that had stood by the rose garden fountain and heard 300 people choose the comfortable lie. She thought about how long each of them had been carrying this alone. She went back inside and called Margaret. "We have a pattern," she said. "Castellano can fight one incident. He cannot fight a documented pattern of behavior with a prior victim willing to testify." Margaret was quiet for 3 seconds. "Grace Calloway," she said finally, "I take back every thought I ever had about attorneys who go into corporate law instead of litigation. You are wasted on mergers." "I know," Grace said. "Let's finish this." The moment Natalie Ashford asked for a private meeting, Grace recognized it for what it was. A woman who had run out of moves and was attempting to negotiate from a position she was pretending was stronger than it was. Grace agreed to the meeting. She arrived with a recording device legally operated under Connecticut's one-party consent law and a phone screen angled precisely where Margaret had instructed. Natalie chose a private dining room at a club she had been a member of for 20 years. She arrived in a dove-gray dress that probably cost $4,000 and sat across from Grace with the particular composure of someone who had been performing grace under pressure for so long that they had forgotten it was a performance. "I want this to be over," Natalie said. "I suspect you do too. Tell me what you're proposing." $5 million. Placed directly in your name. No conditions on custody. Charlotte is yours. Dominic agrees to relocate to Europe and has no contact unless you initiate it. Natalie folded her hands on the table. In exchange, you drop all criminal charges. You sign a comprehensive non-disclosure agreement, and this entire situation goes away. Grace looked at her. Natalie continued, "I know what you think of me, but consider, practically, what a protracted legal battle means. Years of your life, Charlotte growing up in courtrooms, your personal history examined and re-examined by strangers." She tilted her head slightly. "You could take this money and build a real life. Start over. Let this family disappear from yours." "That's a generous offer," Grace said. "I'm a practical woman." "You are," Grace agreed. "You're also the woman who leaked the security footage to the media to trigger a corporate trust clause. You used my assault as a financial instrument." Natalie's expression did not change. "You never saw me as a person," Grace said. "I was a problem to be managed. When it turned out I could be useful, you managed me in a different direction. But the fundamental thing, that I was a human being who had been hurt, that was never relevant to you." "Grace." "Say that again," Grace said. "What you said about what I was supposed to be. A little louder this time." She tapped her phone screen once. The subtle gesture Margaret had showed her for marking a timestamp on the recording. Natalie's eyes dropped to the phone, and for exactly 2 seconds, the first genuinely unguarded moment Grace had ever witnessed from this woman, her composure cracked. Then it reformed. Ice cold, perfectly controlled. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," Natalie said quietly. "I have a very good idea now," Grace said. "Thank you for the meeting." She stood. She picked up her purse. She walked out of the private dining room and through the club and into the April afternoon and called Margaret from the sidewalk. "I have everything," she said. "Good," Margaret said, because Eleanor just found something too, about the trust clause Natalie triggered. Apparently, the clause requires Richard's authorizing signature to be valid, and Richard's signature was obtained on a document Natalie included with his routine annual paperwork while he was recovering from a medical procedure. Post-sedation. His lawyers are calling it fraud. Grace stopped walking. How long until they can reverse it? 48 hours if we move immediately. Then move immediately. Simultaneously, across the city, in a conference room at Castellano's firm, Anthony Castellano received a call from his investigator about Stephanie Crawford's decision to testify. He listened. He asked 3 questions. Then he sat very still for a moment, a documented prior victim, willing to testify with records she had kept for 5 years under an NDA that would likely be voided by any competent judge. This was not a he said, she said situation anymore. This was a pattern. Patterns changed the legal calculus entirely. Castellano was many things. He was not a lawyer who fought unwinnable cases at enormous personal cost to his reputation. He called Dominic. "We have a problem," he said. The custody hearing was scheduled for 9 on a Thursday morning. Grace arrived with Margaret, Harper, Dr. Hensley, and the retired judge Patricia Holloway, who walked into the courthouse with the particular bearing of someone who had presided over it for 20 years and had not entirely forgotten that fact. Owen Grant arrived separately with a complete chain of custody documentation for the footage, the original server logs, the authenticated email he had sent himself 3 days before Dominic's lawyers had ever made contact, the metadata verified by an independent digital forensics firm Margaret had hired. Stephanie Crawford was already there. She had driven from Portland. She had not told Grace she was coming. She had simply appeared, quiet and composed, in a blue coat, sitting in the corridor outside the hearing room with a folder of documents on her lap. Grace saw her and stopped. Stephanie looked up. "I didn't know you'd be here," Grace said. "I know." Stephanie paused. "I should have testified 5 years ago." "I didn't. I took the money, and I signed the paper, and I moved to Portland, and I told myself that was the only option." She held Grace's gaze. "I wanted to be here in case it helped." The hearing lasted 4 hours. Castellano presented his case. Grace's therapy records, the tabloid article, her departure from the marital home, her refusal to engage with co-parenting discussions. He was skilled, measured, and thorough. He made Grace sound like a woman in crisis, making decisions that could harm her unborn child. Margaret dismantled it methodically. She entered the footage, authenticated, chain of custody documented, inadmissibility motion rendered void. She entered Dr. Hensley's 3 years of injury documentation. She called Patricia Holloway, who spoke about Grace's professional character, her intellectual rigor, her judgment, with the particular credibility of a federal judge who had watched her work for 5 years. Then Margaret called Stephanie Crawford. Castellano objected. Margaret cited precedent. The judge, now fully familiar with the case, no longer working from paper, allowed the testimony. Stephanie spoke for 22 minutes. She was calm. She was specific. She had dates, details, and documentation. She described the pattern, the same pattern that Grace had lived, with the precision of someone who had spent 5 years organizing her memories into something coherent in case she ever needed them. When Castellano cross-examined her, she was unmovable. His final question, Ms. Crawford, you accepted a settlement of $800,000. Doesn't that suggest the situation was resolved to your satisfaction? Stephanie looked at him steadily. No, she said. It suggests I was 26 years old and alone and frightened, and someone put a number on the table, and I took it because I thought that was my only option. She paused. I drove 3,000 miles and took no money to be here today. You tell me what my motivation is. The judge retired to chambers. Grace and Harper sat in the corridor. Grace was having early contractions. Mild, irregular, but present. She said nothing about them because the ruling was more important. Harper was timing them on her phone, while very elaborately pretending to play a word game. That was 5 minutes, Harper said, without looking up. I know. The last one was 6. Harper, I'm just noting the trend. The judge will be done in a few minutes. 4 minutes, Harper said. Based on the trend, and that's cutting it, the chamber door opened. The judge returned. Custody remained with Grace. Emergency motion denied. Restraining order upheld. All evidence authenticated and entered into the record. The psychiatric evaluation motion was dismissed as without merit. Harper made a sound that was not quite a word. Margaret did not cry, but her mascara suggested she had been considering it. Grace stood very still in the middle of the courthouse corridor, feeling the weight of the ruling settle through her, relief so complete it felt almost physical. Then her water broke. Harper looked down, looked up, looked at Grace. 4 minutes was optimistic, she said. Margaret was already on the phone. We need a car, now. And before anyone panics, Castellano just received the news about Stephanie's testimony being entered as pattern evidence. She paused. He's withdrawing the defamation suit. Grace, mid-contraction, processed this. All $50 million? All of it. He cited irreconcilable developments in the evidentiary record. What does that mean in plain English? It means we won, Margaret said. Now get in the car. Charlotte Rose was born at 8:37 in the morning. 7 pounds, 2 ounces, healthy, pink. Loudly announcing her arrival to everyone within considerable distance of the delivery room, which Harper later described as the most confident entrance she had ever witnessed from someone who had technically been awake for less than a minute. Richard was in the waiting room. He had arrived at 2 in the morning when Grace's contractions had begun to regularize, and he had sat in a chair in the maternity ward corridor for 6.5 hours, reading nothing, doing nothing, simply being present in the way that people are present when something matters to them more than their comfort. When Dr. Hensley brought him in, he stood at the edge of the room for a moment. Grace held Charlotte out to him. He took her with the careful, trembling reverence of a man holding something irreplaceable. Charlotte curled her fingers around his thumb. That involuntary reflex of newborns, the grip that is purely instinctive and yet somehow communicates everything. Hello, Charlotte Rose, Richard said quietly. I'm your grandfather, and I promise you something right now. You will never have to wonder if you are loved. You will never have to wonder if you are safe. You will always, always know that you matter more than any name or any money or any legacy. He looked at Grace over Charlotte's head. His eyes were wet. Thank you, he said, for trusting me enough to let me be part of this. Grace's mother was on one side of the bed and Harper was on the other, and neither of them said anything, and the room held a particular quality of quiet that felt like the spaces between important things. In the weeks that followed, The various threads of the legal situation resolved with the efficiency of a structure that has lost its load-bearing wall and simply collapses. Natalie's claim to Ashford Industries was reversed within 48 hours of Eleanor's fraud documentation being filed. Faced with potential criminal charges, Natalie accepted a divorce settlement from Richard, $50 million, and the apartment in Savannah where her sister lived, and signed off on every remaining Ashford legal matter without contest. She called Dominic once from Savannah. Grace heard about it later from Eleanor. Natalie had said 3 words. "You are alone." Then she had hung up. Dominic's defamation suit was gone. His custody motion had been denied. His trust fund was in legal dispute. His professional reputation was, as Margaret put it with characteristic understatement, comprehensively addressed by the public record. He filed one final motion 3 months after Charlotte's birth, a renewed request for supervised visitation. It was denied based on his failure to comply with court-ordered anger management requirements, which he had not attended. He did not file again. The divorce finalized when Charlotte was 4 months old. Full custody to Grace. Child support ordered. The prenuptial agreement superseded by the settlement Richard had provided. Structured carefully, legally protected, sufficient to build an actual life. Grace moved into the Connecticut house properly. Not as a safe house, as a home. She painted the nursery yellow. She hung curtains. She put Charlotte's art, finger paintings, crayon drawings, the enthusiastic abstract creations of a child discovering that marks on paper meant something, on the refrigerator with ordinary magnets, and let them accumulate until the refrigerator was more art than appliance. She opened her law license. Margaret had suggested it, and Grace had initially declined, and then one Tuesday morning she had sat across from a woman in Margaret's office. A woman with a bruise covered carefully with makeup and a very practiced explanation for how it had gotten there. And Grace had listened to the explanation and recognized every word of it, and she had leaned forward and said, I know exactly what you're doing because I did it too, and I want to help you." She started consulting on domestic abuse cases. Then she passed the bar reinstatement exam. Then she joined Margaret's firm, part-time, which Harper called the most predictable plot development in the history of this story, which was fair. The Charlotte Foundation came later. Harper ran operations, applied her event planning expertise to fundraising, and proposed a gala theme that Margaret vetoed immediately. They settled on a name that was dignified and accurate. Harper put tiny chandeliers on every table. For irony, she explained. Margaret did not ask for further elaboration. In 2 years, the foundation helped 300 women. Legal resources, safe housing, job training, financial counseling, the specific practical tools that Grace had had access to through Richard's resources and that most women in similar situations did not. Grace spoke at fundraisers. She gave interviews when they focused on survival rather than spectacle. She declined invitations to re-examine the footage, to comment on Dominic's current whereabouts, to provide updates on Natalie's life in Savannah. She was not interested in performing the aftermath of her own trauma for other people's closure. She was interested in Charlotte. Charlotte, at 4 months, discovering her own hands with the intellectual intensity of a philosopher, encountering a new concept. Charlotte at 7 months, sitting up unassisted and looking deeply satisfied about it. Charlotte at 1 year, walking with the particular determination of someone who had decided walking was happening today, whether her legs were ready or not. Charlotte at 2 years old, in the Connecticut garden, on a Sunday morning in spring, holding up a caterpillar she had found near the rose bushes with the triumphant expression of an explorer presenting a significant discovery. "Can we keep it?" Charlotte demanded. "Can we watch it turn into a butterfly?" Grace crouched down beside her daughter. looked at the caterpillar, looked at Charlotte's face, her daughter's face, which was her own face, which was also somehow entirely its own person already. "We can keep it," Grace said. "Watch it change. Watch it grow wings. Why does it fly away when it has wings? Because that's what butterflies do. They transform, they become something new, and then they go where they need to go." Charlotte considered this with the serious deliberation of a 2-year-old encountering a genuinely interesting idea. "Are you a butterfly, Mommy?" Grace thought about caterpillars and transformation and the long, difficult, necessary process of becoming something different from what you were. About the woman who had stood by a fountain in a $7,000 gown and made the first choice in a chain of choices that had led here, to this garden, to this child, to this Sunday morning. "Yeah, baby," she said. "I think I am." Richard called that evening. He was 68 now, slower than he had been, spending more time in Connecticut than Manhattan. He and Charlotte had a Sunday morning pancake ritual that Charlotte took with great seriousness. Measuring, pouring, occasionally getting eggshell in the batter, which Richard informed her was what made them special. "I'm updating my will," Richard said. "Charlotte is the primary beneficiary. I'm also establishing a perpetual trust for the foundation, $10 million. "Richard, you saved my legacy," he said. "The real one. Not the company. The values. The name means something because of what you did. Let me make sure the work continues." After they hung up, Grace sat on the porch of the Connecticut house in the last of the evening light. Harper was inside putting Charlotte to bed, which always involved 3 stories and 2 renegotiations about the 3rd story. The garden was coming into its spring bloom. The roses, Richard's groundskeeper, had been tending for 20 years. The beds Grace had been slowly adding to over 2 springs. The corner where Charlotte had found her caterpillar. Grace's phone buzzed, a text from a number she didn't recognize, which Margaret had taught her to be careful about. But the message read, "I attended your foundation seminar last week. I left today, packed while he was at work. I just wanted to say thank you." Grace typed back immediately, "You gave yourself courage. I'm just proud of you. You are going to be okay." She looked out at the garden. Somewhere in a jar on Charlotte's windowsill, a caterpillar was doing what caterpillars do, building something around itself, changing in the dark, becoming, slowly and without any guarantee of success, whatever it was going to be next. Grace thought about the 16 security cameras, about the footage she had not watched in 2 years and did not need to, about the woman on the bridal suite floor in $7,000 of silk who had reached for her phone over and over, lock, unlock, and not been able to make the call. She had made it eventually. That was what mattered, not that she had seen it coming, not that she had left immediately, not that she had been strong from the beginning. She had made the choice when she was ready, and then she had made the next choice, and then the next one, until the choices added up to a garden in Connecticut and a child named Charlotte, and a life that was entirely, completely, finally her own. Inside the house, she could hear Harper's voice wrying with theatrical emphasis, clearly deep into story number 2, and Charlotte's delighted protest at some narrative development she found unacceptable. Grace smiled. She went inside. To anyone watching who recognizes themselves in Grace's story, in the concealer routine, in the excuses that came too easily, in the practiced way of not seeing what you are seeing, the National Domestic Violence Hotline is 1-800-799-7233. Available 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. You do not need to have a plan yet. You just need to make the call. And to everyone who watched this story to the end, thank you for being here. Thank you for listening. If Grace's courage stayed with you, If this story gave you even one moment of feeling less alone, hit that like button. Subscribe if you want more stories about ordinary people making extraordinary choices, and leave a comment. Tell me which moment hit hardest. I will see you in the next one. Editorial disclaimer. The story you just heard was carefully researched, constructed, and hand-edited by our team, not generated automatically, not copied from any source, but built with intention. From the ground up to carry meaning. We do not create content to shock or exploit. We create it because real human experiences, the fear, the courage, the impossible choices, deserve to be told with care. Every story on this channel is reviewed for accuracy of emotional truth, cultural sensitivity, and the dignity of the experiences it represents. If this story moved you, that was not an accident, it was the point.